Hey there, everybody. Hope you are doing well. Paul here. I am here with my great mate, Kevin Eastman, and we are about live. There he is, socially distancing himself from me. Look, I don't know, the wrong way. Kevin, I'm a little further away from you now. Stop
wait, this way.
That's right. It's the other way, apparently.
I guess this is the shirt I wore just for Paul.
Yeah.
He was telling me he used to have nightmares when he was a kid with the Daleks.
A true story. I used to have nightmares about Daleks, mate. I was terrified of them. And I have a true story as well, like a crazy story about when I went to go work for the immigration service when I was 17 years old, and I was interviewed by one of the original doctors. True story. We'll get there someday. That's going to come in next week's one, which is about crazy stuff, crazy stories. So anyway, we just want to say hi to everybody who is out there. We have Jasneet, who we remember from last week. I am going to try, I don't know, SDJP, how you doing? Jakob from Australia, excellent. All right, Gabriel, Miss Sai is here. Jeff is here from Reach Film. So we want to say hi to all of you guys. Thank you so much for joining in. And today, Kevin and I are going to be talking about the thing that binds us, which is not the Force, it's comic books. Right, mate?
Yes, exactly right. 100%.
And what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about, obviously, the Ninja Turtle comics, which is where you started, although that may not be where you started, right? I want to say there's some other stuff that you were going at with Kevin, right? With Pete Laird, right? Didn't you do like Fugitoid and other things that you were trying to do?
Yeah, it was, even going back, we can go back a little bit further a bit later, but, I was always interested in comics since I was a kid. I had a paper route and I used to run down to the spinner rack at the, 5 miles away. There was a little grocery store that was like it's called Stop and Go, was a version of 7-Eleven, and go in the spinner rack and get the latest fix, especially around that period. It was Jack Kirby's period when he was at DC Comics. So I used to tell and create a lot of my own stories. And I discovered Heavy Metal Magazine and guys like Corbin and stuff, which then I started doing more underground, edgier stuff, but short stories. But when I first met Pete, and Pete was then and still is now a huge robot fanatic, and so we had this idea about a renegade robot on the run, and so we had come up with this thing of this worker robot that was struck by lightning. At the same time, this Professor Honeycutt was helping him out of the fields, who was doing stuff around the yard, and that sort of fused his brain into the circuitry of the robot. And then the robot was blamed for killing the professor, the scientist. So that was our first creation that then we brought into the Turtle universe around issue 4 and 5. And he's been an ongoing part of the Turtle family since the very beginning. And almost every single version of the Turtles. It's great.
So Fugitoid was first for you, right? Was the first book that you got? Fugitoid actually preceded the Ninja Turtles, yeah? It was the first one that you guys did, yeah?
Yep. And in fact, it's like if you look at the Fugitoid, the first couple of strips in the Fugitoid, it was actually an idea that Pete had, which I thought was quite brilliant. Which was he wanted to do these as what he called poster comics, which was just, I guess, roughly a 17 by 22 sheet of paper that you sort of fold it over and then fold it over again. And so the page 1 would be sort of the title and the splash page of the comic. Then you sort of open it up and you've got a spread, which is 2 pages of a traditional style comic story. Page the flip it over to the back of the book, you have another thing, and then you fold it out to this poster thing. It'd be this big dramatic splash page of something. And so there were going to be we were going to do it as these poster comics, which is one step up from mini comics for us. And I think we did 4 or 5, and then never really got off the ground. Turtles got in the way and messed everything up.
What a shame, right? Like, you were going to make your fortune with the Fugitoid, and in the end, the pesky Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles got in the way. Terrible.
It's crazy, but, right?
This, if I'm not mistaken, I kind of found, I pull out these images and stuff, and this one here is the image from the first cover, right? This was the first cover, but this kind of a wraparound cover, is it? Or did it become a wraparound at some point?
No, it was something that we borrowed heavily from Frank Miller's Ronin, of course.
Right.
And I love that the graphic design and conceptual design of what he was doing with Ronin, what they were doing with Ronin was sort of wraparound, half dipped into the back cover, and I love that. So I felt that was a route that we should take with this one. And the first issue had kind of a heavy black border to sort of make it work proportionally. But we did keep the wraparound covers pretty much through the entire run that Peter and I did. It was 11 issues plus the 4 one-shots. But yeah, so this was definitely a huge Miller Ronin influence, the scratchy lines and all that stuff. And I think it was sort of I was a big Miller fan because I was a huge Daredevil fan, and then Daredevil, when Frank Miller came on board, I was a huge Frank Miller, what he did with Daredevil with that character. So I think I was a bigger fan of Frank Miller than he was, and so I kind of pushed that kind of stuff harder. But it's our iconic.
Let's bring it up again. Here's the iconic image. This is it. Yeah. And you know what, man? I mean, it's like, you and I, obviously, when we first met, we sort of, I started working with you doing comics, right? Because I was in like production of the comics and maybe the editorial to some extent, which is basically, frankly, it was like collecting the money from people and stuff like that. There wasn't a lot of editorial to do. But, tell us a little bit, because I think this is kind of really cool. Like, what were your first experiences of comics, man? Like, what was it that you saw? What were your first influences, man? Like, what made you love comic books? Because really, that's how you and I connected, and we ended up going off to Tundra Publishing and doing that.
Yep.
So tell me about your comic stuff, and I'm going to kind of flip through a few images of your comics while we do that. I'll go through Ninja Turtles, but how did you fall in love with comics, man?
It's funny because I was going to ask you the same thing growing up on, many thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
But no, for me, it was, always loved kids' books. When there was actually a kids illustrator named P.D. Eastman. He used to do Go Dog Go and all these different things. But I love children's books a lot, and I would certainly by the time I discovered Maurice Sendak with Where the Wild Things Are and things like that, it was just mind blowing. The visuals just captured my imagination. So when I got into discovered comic books, it was kind of like in part like the spinner rack in a drugstore, a local variety store, that kind of thing. And I quickly became fully obsessed and consumed with them. And then not only to the point of I think probably even worried my parents a little bit, but it was just, I would read them constantly. I knew them inside and out. I knew who drew them, who wrote them. I quickly had favorite artists that I liked. I liked them all, but there was ones that stood out to me. And
who were they? Who were the artists?
Well, early on, I was a huge fan of DC war comics. Joe Kubert was, at that time, as I found out later, Joe Kubert was one of the cover artists, and he did a lot of Sergeant Rock and many of the other stories. But it was he did a lot of covers. So there was the Haunted Tank. There was the Losers. There was Weird War, GI Combat, which was also the Haunted Tank, featuring the Haunted Tank, and but it was I guess Sergeant Rock was very appealing to me because it was just Sergeant Rock of Easy Company. Robert Kanigher, I think is how you pronounce his last name, was the writer, and he just did these great stories that each story ended with a little symbol on it said "Make war no more." So a lot of the stories were didn't glorify war so much. There was action adventure, but there was loss, and there was a lot of heartfelt things. But Russ Heath was one of the artists that drew a lot of these Sergeant Rock comics. It's like his that was it. His line work was just absolutely fantastic. And then with the Losers, which was a really neat concept. In particular, I love the guy named it was a Joe Kubert, early Joe Kubert. But there was John Severin was one of the guys that drew a lot of the Losers comic books and stuff. But I also like, then there was, Marvel had their own line of Sergeant Fury and Combat Kelly and that stuff. But then I also, there was superheroes that I liked, which was, but mostly more the grounded ones, which was, grounded in the context of superheroes, Captain America and Daredevil and Batman and things like that. But Daredevil was one of those ones that was just a particular favorite of mine, and so I sort of had that. But it's funny because when Kirby came along, and I really, because early 70s, I was born in '62, so I was like literally 10 years old, and that's around the time that Kirby was at DC. And the first movie I ever saw in a movie theater was Planet of the Apes. So I discovered Jack Kirby's Commandy, which is basically a furtherance of that whole concept. And that was it. That was the bomb. But Kirby quickly became one of my favorites above all for everything. I really followed his career, and anything he drew, I had to have it. And going back to the back issue bins when finally found out we had a comic book store in Maine. It was. I'm sorry.
I was going to say we'll get into Jack Kirby in a while, because I think for both you and I, like, we have quite a reverence for the giants that we stood on their shoulders, kind of thing. That's an important person in comics that most people don't realize how important he was. But those were your first. I mean, Daredevil. What was your favorite when you were a kid? What was it?
It was probably like Captain America and the Falcon. There was a really great period that Sal Buscema was drawing him, and I just liked it, and that was just right in my wheelhouse. I kind of like that. But Daredevil was Gene Colan was drawing a lot of them. An artist named Bob Brown. But those were sort of my favorites, and it was always it's funny, and because I had a couple friends that were geeks like me, geeks like me, and we all read comics together and trade them and stuff. But you had guys that were either like Marvel or DC, but you couldn't like them both, and I was like, what? So I just liked what I liked, and that was it. And I liked the Marvel and DC. But it was the sense of adventure. I grew up in a very small town in Maine, so those stories that took place in New York City or Gotham or Metropolis and stuff, it might as well have been. There you go. That was the shit right there. It might as well have been 100 miles away, because we didn't have any places like that where I grew up. There was a lot more cows and dairy farm.
Yeah, man, I hear you. I had kind of a weird situation with comics, because I couldn't get them. Like we just were in a place where we didn't have them, my brother and I, and yet my grandmother, my little Nan, who who loved so much, my grandmother, she used to make sure that she would send my brother and I a rolled up tube of comics every week. And she couldn't do it, but that's where we only saw comics. We were lucky enough to see the British reprints of Spider-Man and Daredevil. So those were the first two characters that I knew. So clearly I was exposed to Marvel. And then she would send us the British comics, which were these one strip daily comics that had crazy characters in, like Hungry Horace, who ate a load of food, and and they were literally one and done. It was 1 page strip, and every week they would do the same thing, and then they would you just buy the next one, right?
So like things like 2000 AD and stuff, that's much later. Those characters.
Yeah, that was a little later. That was. That came out in 1977, 78, something like that. So that was later. The first ones were reprints of the Marvel comics. And so, I just thought that Spider-Man lived in London. That was something that I thought Spider-Man was in London because he lived in a city, and that was the only city I knew. I didn't even have a sense of what America would be, right? And the other thing that we got in Great Britain was we got these British, like, war comics called Commando and stuff like that, and they were really small. They were only about this big, and you'd open them and it would be like the main character would kill like 10,000 Germans with one burst of his Tommy gun. It was crazy, right? And so all these crazy war stories. So I've always loved war stories, and I loved comics, but I had no sense that I would work in comics, right? And one thing that was really funny about me was that we had a friend of the family who went to live in Canada, and many years later, I'd end up doing quite well in comics. And I reestablished connection with this guy, Colin, and he said, I always knew that you would work in comics, Paul. And I said, well, how did you know? I didn't know. And he said, because when you were a kid, I used to walk in and you would be on the ground drawing comics, which is true. I used to love drawing comics.
Wow.
So my first ever, I never quite hit the art style of you, Kev. You know, I never managed to get to your pinnacle, but I did draw an amazing first comic. It was Spider-Man versus Dudley Moore. It made no sense, but it was Spider-Man versus Dudley Moore. And then I found the picture, and it said Spider-Man versus Dudley Moore. And then underneath it said with a black face. And I had colored Dudley Moore's face in black because I realized that my image looked nothing like Dudley Moore. So I know myself, and I was really annoyed that I couldn't make him look like Dudley Moore. Miss Sai is an old style comedian that used to, you know, he was in Arthur, the movie Arthur. And for some reason, I had Spider-Man fight him for no reason whatsoever. So there you go.
Well, that's, you know, but you know, just you just captured that was the essence of that was what was fascinating about comic books to me, and that's what I think I fell in love with very early on. You know, from some of the kids' books influence to the natural evolution of the comic books, illustrated stories. Was it just seemed to me that if you could write them and draw them, whatever you could imagine, you could go there. So if it's Spider-Man fighting Dudley Moore, then hey, that's the story you want to tell. But it was like that you could do, you know, Robin Hood to World War II to 2001, some Star Wars type adventure, and it was just wherever you could imagine. So that was from early on. I felt like that's what I liked so much about Kirby, and is you understood because you'd read the credits in the Marvel or DC comics, and it'd be like written by, penciled by, inked by. So you knew there's a whole team of people, lettered by, and all that stuff. So, but it seemed like guys, when you see like when Kirby was especially doing DC period, it was edited, written, and drawn by Jack Kirby, by somebody else, and so I thought that was it. That was cool that he did all of those things. That's what I wanted.
Did you think when you were a kid, did you think that you would be a comic guy? Is that what you thought you might like to do? Or did you have any sense of what you wanted to be when you grew up? Was it a comic guy? Because me, I wanted to be a hedgehog doctor.
A hedgehog doctor? That's all. No, I think it was, there's a while with, as I mentioned I like war comics for a while. And I think that I thought I would be going to the army and do something like that. Because it was still the kinds of comics I was reading when still, World War I and World War II was still considered, great wars, if you will, Korea and Vietnam. We really understood that, but mostly it was from day one. It was always comics. I wanted to do something in comics, and that's what I think really mortified my parents, and that I think they really did think I had special needs, and that I might never move out of the basement of the house. And that so it's very very old fashioned New England family. So it was always very much, go to school, you get your grades, you go to trade, something that you can support the family, and so on and so on. So they were dead set against it.
I found a page, by the way, it has Fugitoid right there, which is really nice. Early pages, and so years later, you end up working in comics because you go through this black and white thing, and you do Fugitoid, then you do Ninja Turtles, and then Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles takes off. And before it becomes a toy and a TV show, this is what it was, and most people sometimes don't realize that Ninja Turtles was your black and white comic way before it was the Archie comics or the colored bandanas or anything. It was this, and it's at times, would you agree, it's a little darker, man? It's not actually as light as, it's a little rougher, and right, it's not as light as the Turtles that many people know, right?
Oh, for sure. No, that was, and that was a little bit confusing early on, especially when we were talking to like the guy that that ran Playmates Toys, a guy named Bill Carlson, was very religious, and he was very, very, very concerned about the level of violence in some of the early black and white comics, and so was Jim Henson. When Steve Barron had told me later that when he showed the comics, showing some of the original comics that he liked, Henson and Jim Henson was very concerned about the level of violence in them. But it was, and I say that truth, when we did those early issues, they were written and drawn specifically for Peter and I. We assumed that nobody would really be reading these. That it was just sort of like, so we just wrote these stories for ourselves, but they were still like, they were probably edgier and that it dipped into violence levels that you were seeing around that time from the progression of comics. Like, Ronin was very violent, and Batman, and Batman and stuff. But comics were starting to grow up, and it was that merging of, when I accidentally stumbled onto Heavy Metal magazine, which led me to not only European artists, but Richard Corbin and Von Bodie and guys like that were in the early issues of Heavy Metal magazine. And so when I went to the first real comic book store, it was a place called Million Year Picnic in Boston. That's when I found a lot of underground comics like Cerebus the Aardvark. And there was a lot of edge, because they were rebelling against the institution, man. Because Marvel and DC still had the Comics Code Authority, so they were restricted for generally 12 years old and younger. And so they were sometimes went to extremes, the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers and Rip Off Press. And
Freak Brothers, man. The Freak Brothers were great. I love the Freak Brothers.
No, I was like, my dad had I went to visit my dad in Arizona one year, and I was a huge comic nut, and he had just, and I hadn't really seen even underground comics or discovered heavy. I was probably 6th or 7th grade, just middle school. And he had Freak Brothers comics, and I just poured through them and was like, what are these? This is awesome.
Yeah, so, it was crazy. It was all drug culture, and Fat Freddy's cat was hilarious, and it was totally against it. I discovered that stuff when I was maybe 13 or 14. I got Heavy Metal magazine, which is a European magazine to some extent because of all the content. I remember reading a story by Enki Bilal called "The City That Never Moved." That was Bilal, I think, right? And I was blown away by the story. I was like, wow, comics are incredible, right? They're much more. And then, of course, in Great Britain, we get 2000 AD. And so the 2000 AD stories are really groundbreaking, written by, some young guy named Alan Moore and all this crazy stuff that was coming out. So comics are incredible. And I've often said, and I think you agree with me, that if you think about it, they're the oldest form of human artistic expression. Cave paintings are comics, right? That comes from the days of Tundra. The sequential narrative is drawn on caves. So they're hardwired into the human brain. And hey, I have a quick question here from Miss Sai, who asked the question, since we're on the Ninja Turtles, well, non sequitur. I think we've covered this, but we'll go again. Who was it who thought up the respective bandana colors after they became thing? Because I want to say that was Pete had a lot to do with that, right?
Yeah, it was. Because back in those days, Pete and I were both flying out. Pete eventually stopped flying. I don't blame him.
Right.
But in the early days, we were going out to Playmates a couple different times and visiting them for toy design and concept work and stuff, and it would be double duty because you were developing the animated series stuff along with the toys, because they were sort of had to go. They had to develop together to work as a whole licensing thing. But it was, they basically said, well, how can you tell them apart? Because they're black and white comic books, and they just have all red bandanas on the covers, and it was, we're like, well, it's the weapons, and and we did a lot of, hey Mike or hey Don before everything, so you knew who it was, and you'd always try to show the weapons so you could separate them. But they said, in animation, we want to try things like maybe even make the green of their skin tone different shades of green. Want to be a little lighter, want to be a little darker. But then, and Pete said, well, how about if we made the bandanas different colors? which was with some logic to it. Orange, Michelangelo, was a silly color. Blue for Leonardo was samurai sword, sort of a regal, sort of royal samurai-ish thing. Raphael with the red because it was our like a Wolverine guy, so he's a raging red, and then Donatello with the purple is sort of more of a pacifist style weapon. He had the bow staff. So that was where that came, and they went a little bit further and added the letters, the initials to their belts, which we felt was a little over the top, but it was also like hey, okay, we know the black and white comic books were written for an older audience and at this level, and we know this is specifically a younger audience.
These are some of the images from the original black and white comics. I mean,
first appearance of April, the first.
Is this the first? I was going to say this here is one of the first images of April, right?
It is. That's well, it's like this is kicks off issue 3, so it's issue 2 was where that's where the Mausers come into play, and she was a scientific assistant to Baxter Stockman, who created these things. So this is the second. This is where we decided we really liked April as a character. We had her in issue 2, so this is after the Turtles saved the day in issue 2. This was sort of a furtherance as we went into issue 3, and my favorite part about issue 3 was when Pete and I were discussing the idea. I told him I wanted to do a car chase in a comic, and he was just like, "Nah, that's stupid. No, nobody's going to do a car chase in a comic because that's who wants to see a car chase in a comic." So I said, "Well, if you did it right, I think it would be really fun." So we have a 13-page car chase where the police are chasing April and all 4 turtles in the VW van, which the VW van, I know I borrowed that from Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, because they had a VW van back in the day. So I wanted April to have a VW van.
If you're going to get anything from the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, it would just be people stoned out of their mind laying on the floor, because there wasn't much going on in the Freak Brothers more than that. It was just how can they buy drugs was basically the main story. One thing I want to say here, which Jasneet brought up, that you do, and I've often bragged on you a little bit behind your back, unfortunately, that your layouts are pretty. I mean, that was the thing of you, wasn't it? I can't speak to your art as well as you can, but I will say that your layouts were always a big thing for you, and how you laid out a book and how juxtaposed panels against each other was really important. So comic book storytelling is complicated, right? It's difficult, but layouts and the thumbnails and all the beginning of it is the hardest part, in my opinion. Well, apart from the writing,
Yeah, I know it is. It's a very delicate balance, because it is like we grew up and we had say if we were fans of Iron Man or Captain America or whoever, then there might be a specific art team, a writer, an artist that you particularly liked, and they might do that series for say 4 or 5 issues or even 12 issues, and then they move on to something else, and then they bring in a new team, and you might not like them as much. And then to me, I would notice differences in the subtleties from how they moved to comic, how they paced, how they chose shots of dramatic, and I lean heavily on Jack Kirby, which his stuff was always very explosive. It was very rigid in his control, but his 2-page spreads, and it was really those splash pages that looked like they jumped out. It was 3-dimensional practically. But then sort of combining with what Frank Miller was doing, which is obviously a huge influence, and I think of Frank's work quite often when I lay stuff out, because he was very cinematic in his approach. Kelly loved movies as much as we all did, but he would sort of be thoughtful in his pacing, and it was to me that I recognized early on something even as silly as page turns, because and I'm sure that frustrated you when you were writing for say more of a mainstream comic which has a lot of ads in it, that if you're thinking of a left to right layout, so you want that page turn, so you lay it out so your right hand page at the bottom has got that moment of like what, so you turn the page, and this, but if you got a Hostess cupcake ad which you're turning to, sometimes it could probably frustrating. But that was to me was the most exciting part, and I was never a very solid writer. I'd have ideas that juvenile at best, and then sort of
Cute.
it was hard to. Well, like you didn't have a lot of depth in them sometimes, and so that's what I think. What he and I were, the balance was really good, is that he was a lot more well read, and he would bring important chunks of story to help have an action scene that I wanted to do evolve. And so, because I would always avoid things that were challenging, which was acting. It's like, I look at back, even comics that I'm doing now, it's hard for me to make a particular character look the same panel to panel, issue to issue, as well as have that person act and emote the way that you need it to tell, especially a more delicate story.
Well, one of the things I can tell you from my early days of writing comics, we'll get into that in a little bit. But I used to, I'm annoying, right? I'm really meticulous. And so one of the things I used to petition my editors on Hellblazer when I first got that gig was, can you tell me where the ad placement is? Because I'm going to end a scene just before the ad. Because if I could end a scene just before the ad, then people would already be out of that scene, and then they would see the ad and it wouldn't really matter. Then they could turn the page and and they would be able to kind of pick up the story again because the scene had ended.
Did they do that? Did that work? That's awesome.
They did very briefly, and then they found out it was harder for them to do their job, and then they stopped doing it. But for a brief golden period, I actually would end scenes where the ads were, where the ad placement was, which was really cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's hard to do, but it's not impossible, right? So as long as it's not impossible, I don't care. Hard is fine, right? But we're looking. Look, where's that one from? This image right here.
I'm pretty sure this is a fan image.
Okay, cool. I quite like the way they did the red bandanas. That's why I picked that one out.
I know this guy's work. He's given us stuff at conventions before. It looks so familiar. Apologies for forgetting who it actually is, but no, that's honestly, Courtney and I have just boxes of these amazingly awesome gifts that fans have given us over the years. And, pages and pinups and things like that. But
now at this point, I am contractually obliged to tell everybody to smash the like button, right? Forgot. We're 30 minutes in and we haven't said it. Smash the like button, get everybody in, advertise our stream. We're having fun, right? And so, a lot, actually, maybe I did pick up some fan stuff. I don't know. I mean, I know this one is not, right? I love that image. That's a great one.
You know what? You'll love this. This is a good story to this one is, over the years, I've gotten to know and be friends with Robert Rodriguez, the Sin City Desperado El Mariachi director, and awesome guy. Robert is a lot of people don't know what a fantastic artist he was. When he was in college, he had a strip, which I still a newspaper strip in this local college newspaper that was called Los Hooligans. And I keep trying to get him to reprint it and put it out there. I think it's probably like 150 sequential, like outland, Berkeley Breathed kind of stories of Doonesbury, 4-panel strips of the college newspaper, and it's great. So Robert and I got to be friends, and he was showing me these drawings one day, and I'm like, dude, do you ever want to do a cover? You ever done a comic book cover? And he said, no. And I said, well, they're coming up on the 30th anniversary of the Turtles, and I'm doing a couple special covers. I said, if I pencil something, will you ink it? And he was like, yeah. So I penciled this, and Robert Rodriguez inked it. It's 2015. You can see the date. Hello. And my friend Tommy colored it. So yeah.
That's cool, man. That's really cool. I like this comment. Alex over here says the last thing that you want in the comic is to have your story interrupted by an ad for Hostess Twinkies or fruit pies. But let me point something out, Alex. When you are a little kid in Britain, that when I would see American comics, I so wanted to come to America because I was going to eat a Hostess blueberry pie because there are no blueberries in Great Britain. I was going to eat a Hostess blueberry pie, and then I was going to get myself a submarine out the back. I was going to sell the seeds and then get myself because to me, reading the ads of the old comics was brilliant. And then I came to America and I ate a fucking Hostess blueberry pie, and I was like, oh my God.
Were you not as thrilled as you should have been?
Yeah, it wasn't quite as great as I thought it might be, but yeah, you know, at least I'd eaten one at that point. So,
because I always tell the thing is like, so I used to, when I had my paper route when I was a kid, you know, I'd make about $3.50 a month, and that's what I'd use to buy comics. Comics are 20 cents a piece, so I'd actually, you know, ride my bike. It was probably 3 or 4 miles or so. Buy my comics, and then I'd have enough money left over to buy a Twinkie and a Yoo-hoo. Sad excuses for a chocolate drink or whatever. So I'd eat my Twinkie and drink my Yoo-hoo and read the first few comic books on the steps of the store before I then would ride home.
Yeah, because hang on, I'm sending my wife a text that says, "Could you get my kid to stop banging the floor up above my head?" I don't know if everyone can hear this, but to me, it's the loudest thing ever. How can a 9-year-old sound like an elephant? I have no idea. Working from home, baby. Yeah, so I don't even know if some of these images that I'm bringing up, like these may well be fan things or other things, but I quite like this one that Stogie found. That was a pretty good one.
I'm gonna have to think of the name of the guy that did that one.
Yeah, do you know that one?
I think it's Paul something, but I'm afraid it just slips my mind completely. But what's interesting about this piece is he did this drawing, and then this Chinese company called Good Smile did a set of statuettes that were all interlocking based on this guy's drawing.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
fantastic. I mean,
pretty cool that one. I like that one. Yeah. And it goes to show, right, that comic art is art in general. This is mad.
I love that one.
Art in general can just be so useful. You know, it's so good. Like comic art, comic style art is so brilliant, man. You know, there's so much that can be done. I remember that when I first came to work for you, you really like Richard Corbin, which is funny because I really like Richard Corbin because I was really into Heavy Metal magazine. And you ended up getting, I mean, one of the first books I think I was working on was a Corbin crossover. It was like a Corbin version of the Ninja Turtles. Man, that thing is great. You know, like that stuff is so cool. That comic art can be so different and so expressive, from Bill Sienkiewicz to Richard Corbin to you know, Mobius to Jack Kirby. All of this dynamic quality of art is so cool. And then Eastman and Laird and Turtles. I mean, everyone's got their style. Everyone's got their. Look, I wanted to find this. This is great, by the way. This thing cracks me up. This, I've seen this before. So tell us about this thing.
I'm pretty sure we use this as the back cover for something, but this was done as a. Man, I know it's done some kind of promotional thing, and it might have been for the CBG or something. And you know, I'm looking at the time period here because it's probably dated somewhere, but I know Pete's mocked up Turtles issue 6, and I've got the Michelangelo cover that I'm working on. But it was one of those kind of fabricated things, because Pete and I did for a while. We worked together in the same room, Mirage Studios. But by the time we get to having an office, we didn't do that as much anymore. But it was kind of like those old advertisements you'd see sometimes in back of a Marvel comic where they talk about the Marvel bullpen, and you'd do this sort of cutaway drawing, and you'd see, like, you know, these rows of drawing tables, and it'd be like, you know, caricatures of Jack Kirby and, you know, Al Milgrom or, you know, Stan Lee, and they're all sort of working side by each and having a great time drawing comic books, which just was never the reality when we knew it was a reality. But we liked the idea because we had this dream of going to work for Marvel, working up on one of those, you know, on the 26th floor, right, you know, down the hall would be so and so and so and so, and this is most of them worked at home, the studio anyway. Like,
that's right.
So that was a kind of a homage to that.
Yeah, I love how people think that like doing comics is glamorous, and it's like doing comics is like staying awake till 4 o'clock in the morning and like falling asleep on your drawing table and then doing it again. You know, it's not. The only time it's potentially glamorous is when you're at a convention and there's loads of people who are really cool, you know, and obviously the fans, you know, being around the fans is cool. You know, I've I've definitely enjoyed a chance to have fans like come up and get a signature and be excited to meet me and stuff like that. That stuff never gets old, man. Like loving the fans of comics are like a unique breed. They're interesting people, but they're always cool and they're always interesting. And very rarely do you get anyone that's kind of crappy. And if you do, I'm fine with it anyway. Like, okay, you know, like they can tell me like you ruined Spider-Man. I'm like, thankfully, I finally ruined Spider-Man.
You know? No, I always I remember, and this goes back to you know, our hero, our mutual hero Kirby, in that I'm pretty sure it was San Diego Comic-Con. Probably I'm pretty sure it was 1986. But it was that was one of the local conventions that Kirby would go to, come down from Thousand Oaks, and Pete and I were so desperate to meet him because we were such a huge fan. So we were like, you know, had a little space at the end of a friend of ours that had a real proper booth. It was like more of like a flea market back in those days. And so you sort of hear this hush and this sort of whisper sort of echoing through the building where, you know, Kirby's here, Kirby's here, Kirby's here. So Pete and I like literally threw down our stuff and ran to go meet Jack Kirby. And so by the time we got to where he was, and this is San Diego, for anybody that knows anything in the history of San Diego Comic-Con, it was when they were at the Civic Auditorium, which is about 5 blocks from where the convention center is now. Just basic civic center. And so he was already kind of sitting, and he was surrounded by about 50 people. And he was in the middle of, we showed up and sort of muscled our way through, and he was just telling a story about how he and Joe Simon created Captain America. And so everybody, you know, us is hanging on every word. And then so he finishes, and then fan kind of standing right next to the guy that I think asked that question in the first place was so nervous he didn't know what to ask, so he asked the same question. How did you guys create Captain America? And Kirby, without missing a beat, didn't make the fan feel little, you know, embarrassed in any way. Kirby just told the same story again with every moment. You know, well rehearsed, and you know, just he loved what he did, and he gave that fan a moment. And I just remember thinking to myself that you know, if I'm ever lucky enough to have fans, I hope I treat them the same respect that Jack Kirby treats his fans.
Well, I can tell you something that is I think a good compliment to you, mate. You know, it's why we've been friends for so long. Is that all of my career, I've made a point of being like a mentor to people, and I made a point of being the cool guy. I hope, you know, like really kind to fans and all of that. But I got that because of the way that I saw you be when you were like rock star, Ninja Turtle, kind of like, man, you can do anything you like. You were always pretty straightforward. And then you would tell me what Kirby would be like. And I would always see like good people really acting quite humbly, and people on just a slightly lower level would always act like jackasses. And I hate the idea that anybody would ever be a jackass to a fan at a convention, because the fans they pay our wages, you know? And so why would we be mean to somebody or to be demeaning to someone? And if you got Jack Kirby that's going to do that, everybody should do that, you know, because he was the forerunner. And so I love the idea that, you know, having humility to some extent is an indicator perhaps that you're confident and that you know who you are, and that's good, right? You know, that you can accept yourself for your flaws and everything. So, you know, Kirby's someone that I care very much about. You know, he's somebody who really, frankly, you think Stan Lee invented it? Jack Kirby invented it. That's pretty much the way that it was, you know. And I know that Stan enjoys a lot of reverence, and I know Stan has a very special place in this industry. But the fact is, Jack Kirby was the person that really was the creative driving force behind the creation of so many characters, from, you know, X-Men, Hulk, you know, you name it, Captain America, all of these things that he was involved with. Another person that I think deserves recognition would be Steve Ditko, because he generally was a person who pretty much created Spider-Man, and he had a difficult time. You know, he did not get on with Stan, obviously. you know, and Stan was a wonderful person, interesting guy. I was very lucky to have had a couple of interactions with him. But Ditko and Kirby, those guys created an awful lot of stuff for Marvel and for Stan, you know, and they deserve recognition at least, you know.
No, you're right, and I think it was you know, and you know, back in actually even in you know around the time that you're doing a lot of shows and you know, getting to meet a lot of you know people that we you know admired. We were getting you know temporary heroes, more like I would say like say Barry Smith, for example, or Mike Kaluta, or Bernie Wrightson, or the Frank Millers, or the Alan Moores, and the people that were you know sort of like we came after those guys. Those guys came right on the heels of guys like you know Jerry Robinson and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and so many others that really were living through and rebelling against the work for hire system where the corporation owned everything, not just the way they did business back then. It's no excuse. It's no excuse to make it right. We all know that, and they knew it. And even I remember Mike Kaluta told me the story once that he used to sign. You know, they would basically print on your check that by endorsing this check and cashing this check, you are giving away all your rights to the work you did for this check. And so Mike would always sign it, signed under protest, Mike Kaluta.
Nice.
So it was a time where we were all kind of becoming aware that in so many of those cases that they not only kept all the rights, but they kept all of the artwork. And I think, you know, even Stan, who, you know, deserves you know, a significant amount of credit, he was the company guy. He was the guy. He was a very creative guy. But the company was built on the house of people that worked under Stan. And I think because he was kind of the corporate guy, he was like he had to sort of toe the company line and then take these positions that, in my heart, I believe he knew was wrong, but he was a company guy. And again, not that he didn't have anything to do with it. He was there at the time, but I think he later, you know, when it became more real to everybody, and everybody clearly knew that the importance of what Jack contributed, what Steve Ditko contributed, and so many other people that contributed to the Marvel Universe, that he would sort of pull back on his, you know, well, I created everything, and these guys work for me. I created everything, and they work for me. To the point where, you know, he would mention many times, you know, Jack Kirby was the most creative guy he's ever met in his entire life. Stan. But you know, even like that was, I love there's a documentary that came out about Bill Finger recently, maybe within the last 2 years, and just looking for, because Bob Kane, you know, forever did the Stan Lee thing that he said that, you know, he created Batman, you know, whole, you know, 100% in, you know, top to bottom, and lived this lie for a long time, and never gave guys like Bill Finger and other people that really came up with the concept of characters, the underlying characters, the secondary characters, the entire Batman universe.
Yeah.
So it's you know, and I feel like, you know, and we've talked about this a few times, and you know, we've met you know, the comic business in, you know, the UK. There was some similarities. The structures were very similar to things that were created, you know, with Judge Dredd and the Warriors and those kinds of things. And it's just
Well, one person that you and I are very familiar with is this hairy lunatic. Someone that I love, right? So I was Alan's editor at Tundra on Big Numbers, and also From Hell originally. Actually, I had that book, and I was lucky enough to work with Alan, and he was really kind to me, right? Like Alan Moore, you know, for those of you who may, if any of you have been living under a rock, Alan created Watchmen. He created V for Vendetta. He created the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, From Hell. I mean, this is a guy who's incredibly prolific. When I was a little kid, he created half the stuff you read in 2000 AD, including 2000 AD's Future Shocks, which were brilliant single-page stories, right? Complete lunatic. And I have some great stories for Alan. Now, we're going to save some of these because next week, you and I are going to go full-on crazy. It's going to be a whole a whole thing of all the crazy crap that you and I have, because there's a bunch of crazy, and some of it is Alan. I will remind you, we might as well just give a little teaser. How about a teaser of Alan meeting my brother in the Brown Set?
God, it's like, I don't know how you can even explain it. I mean, I'll describe like Alan Moore, looking like he is, you see in the picture, but he was wearing a
brown suit.
Brown suit. It was exquisite, beautifully pressed, double-breasted, buttoned down with a trench coat sort of draped over the shoulders. It was just like you couldn't get a more perfect picture of elegance and fashionability with this crazy animal from the Muppet sort of head sort of stuck on the top of it. You know, and it was just one of those things. I think people saw it and were just like, because he's also very tall as well, and I think that was we were in the Browns.
Yeah, we're in the Browns Hotel. Yeah, we're in the Browns Hotel. Yeah,
very, very, very posh. We didn't fit in there very well. I know I didn't, but it was around tea time, and Alan had come in to have a meeting with us and stuff. And your brother was coming to visit and drop off some indispensable items that some of the people that were in our party that needed. And he had a mohawk at the time, right?
Yeah, no, my brother had basically a red, white, and blue mohawk like he normally did. And he came into the Browns Hotel, which might be the poshest hotel in London, so that he could bring comestibles to the people. Basically, he brought weed. So actually, it wasn't even weed. The best part was it was like red Lebanese hash. It wasn't
exactly. It was happening.
It was like this really tarry kind of stuff, right? So when they needed to be hooked up, my brother hooked everybody up. And so he comes into the Browns Hotel, and now we're sitting around, and Alan and my brother are just yucking it up and hanging out.
Well, they weren't going to let him in. They were like, they blocked him at the door. I was like, sorry, you can't come in here. And he was like, you know, he went full on, you know, punk. And he was screaming at him. He's like, ah! And they finally just let him go to come in.
They just like let him come in, and he's like, do you know who I'm with? And then he pointed at us. They're like, okay, well, I guess you better come in then. They look as bad as you do. So anyway, so Alan Moore, getting back to him, man, I mean, you know, I had come into working in comics at that point, and I had come through Mirage. Now I came into Tundra Publishing, and you and I did that publishing company. We are going to do a whole series on Tundra. That's going to be an interesting set of stories, because there are some untold stories of that are brilliant.
Absolutely.
And also heartbreaking. But Alan, you know, was working with us, and he's a guy who got treated really badly, I think. I mean, you know, he created Watchmen, and my understanding of it is that they said, well, you know, if it goes out of print, it can return to you. And he said, okay, great. And then they made sure it never went out of print, but not necessarily because of the sales, just because they wanted to keep ownership of Watchmen. And that was something that he was furious about, and said, you know, I'm going to curse you. By the way, I just want to point out, over here we had Charlie, my nephew. This is my nephew, Richard, also known as Cider, because actually his name is Cider, who ended up in Hellblazer. And his comment on my brother is classic dad. Can you believe Rich the Punk is now a dad? It's great, you know. So yeah.
We got to tell the story about how you and Richard ran yourselves over with a golf cart one day. So
we did run ourselves. I may as well get into it. So my brother, this is how crazy my brother is. My brother and I grew up in the back end of nowhere, and one point he comes over to America, and you have to understand, I've got to find a picture of him. I'll try to see if I can put one up, right? My brother is as lunatic as anybody you've ever met, right? He's just a complete loon. So he decided he wanted to play golf, right? And if there's a person who is least likely to be on a golf course, that is going to be my brother, Richard. And so, I took him out playing golf, and okay, yeah, let's see if I can show you. This would be quite a famous picture of my brother.
Sure, you know, a lot of people don't know you're a very talented golfer as well, but
Yeah,
it's funny. Richard seems like a guy he seems like a guy that Guy Ritchie would cast in one of his movies. He flicked right from the East End of London.
right. So my brother, this is a picture of my brother. This is the one I could find. The significance of this picture is this is in 2002. Cider, my nephew, will recognize this. This is a picture of my brother when they took over Stonehenge and they were booted off by the police. Right? And my brother ended up on the front pages of the newspapers because he was kicking a copper in the head. I ended up talking to him and he was like, "Can't talk right now, I'm busy." And he was busy fighting with a policeman. It was brilliant. So my brother comes over and he wants to play golf with me, and he's a complete maniac. And so we went golfing, but we went drinking at the same time as golfing. And we were already drunk when we got to the golf course. And the way it worked was, it was a little 9-hole course, and we drove around the course and we would buy another 6-pack. And by the time we had played 35 holes, we were so drunk we couldn't stand, right? And we started going down a hill, and my brother went too fast. And I said, "We're going too fast." And I grabbed it, and it was a 3-wheel golf cart, and it pulled the bar and it bucked the two of us off. And we went rolling down the hill, and I looked around, and the golf cart was bouncing towards us, and it bounced literally on top of me and then bounced down the hill. And we lay there, and I thought, well, my brother's dead, because he was laying on his front, and he was just staring at the ground, shaking. And I thought, well, my brother's dead. I've killed him. And then I realized he was laughing. Right? That's typical of my brother. So we stood up, and we were so drunk, and we found out that his rental clubs were all bent in half, and the only club that wasn't bent was the ball retriever. So we managed to get and drive that down to the clubhouse, and then we left the clubs outside, and we ran off the course. It was great. Anyway, there's my brother. That's the story of my brother. We'll get to that later because there's a lot of crazy in all of this. In early days when you and I worked together, we worked with Alan. We were very reverent to some of these people. Rick Veitch, Dave McKean, George Pratt, who I think is just the most amazing artist. Like, George Pratt's work was brilliant. And so then I got like my turn, which was mad, right? I went away I'd been editor-in-chief actually at Tundra, and then for a little while at the end. And then I went away to a company called Majestic, which was another typical thing. They were in bankruptcy. They weren't paying their artists. I got annoyed immediately and said, "You have to pay your artists." Hey, Charles. We see Charles showing up, so saying hi to everybody. And Toka's there as well. Yeah. So I move away. I go to Majestic. Kind of the last you see of me for like, because I went and lived in Cincinnati for a couple of years was, "Oh yeah. Well, he's kind of moved on to go do another job." And then in the middle of that, like, I came back and I ended up getting into writing Hellblazer, which is crazy because at one minute I'm like I'm working in the editorial side of it, and the next thing you know, I get to write comics, which I'm telling you, man, was not my chosen career. I was going to be a filmmaker, but I had found a different way, and I was now working in comics. And so
what's interesting is, I was just thinking, what's interesting is I know you worked on there was a comic you co-plotted and wrote with Craig Farley at Mirage, and you were around all the stuff that was going on in Mirage Studios on the comic line. And when you came to Tundra, there was so many different aspects of just logistics, which is was important to have. I felt it was important to have you as the sort of the main liaison with so many of the British creators that we ended up gravitated to Tundra as a company. I mean, everybody from Neil Gaiman to Dave McKean to Alan Moore to Simon Bisley and a bunch of others. So it's just, what's interesting is that you were overseeing and editing and commenting and from at that level a lot of different kinds of comic books. So it's sort of like, I can imagine what it must have been like when you jumped into it, but at the same time you've been sort of sleeping and breathing comic books in general for all those years at Tundra. I remember
Yeah.
just popped in my head was the first time we looked at when Alan Moore sent in the script, I think maybe Big Numbers issue 3 or 4, and it was like that thick, and you were like, what?
Ridiculous. Yeah.
It was like there's a massive amount of pages that he could write for those kind of things. So
Yeah.
but no, you can definitely see the progression of just the experience that you had in dealing with so many different kinds of creators in the whole world of comics. So
Yeah, there it is, man. This was my first book with you that I finally got to write one for Mirage Studios. It was my one Ninja Turtle comic that I did, which was really cool. Craig Farley's a great artist, and I wonder, I'm not sure if he's underrated. I don't know if people know him, but I always thought his art was really good. Really great artist. And so, yeah, I can tell you how I learned to write comics, because I used to get Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore's comics in, and I'm like, I would read them voraciously. I want to learn how to write these things, and so that's where I got my comics. So yeah, I got to write just one Ninja Turtle comic, which was cool. I go away and I come back on, and the next thing you know, I go down. So my break into comic story is I broke into comics as a writer the only way that you cannot break into comics, which was going down to San Diego Comic-Con and meeting the editor of Hellblazer and asking him, can I write Hellblazer? And he said, well, what have you written? And I said, I've got to be honest with you, mate, I've not written anything. And how you can't break into comics like that. There's just no way to break into comics doing that, because that's just stupid. But I had worked with you, and I know that Karen Berger from Vertigo, who's the editor-in-chief, she knew me because a lot of our Vertigo guys. So we had Neil Gaiman, we had Alan. He wasn't a Vertigo guy, I don't think, but we had Dave McKean, we had a bunch of Kent Williams, a bunch of people. So we kind of knew Karen. I didn't know what I could do, so I just asked, can I write Hellblazer? And the next thing you know, my first issue was Hellblazer number 89, which was set in Australia. I didn't even want to write those 2 issues, to be honest, but I took over from Eddie Campbell, who did 4 issues of Hellblazer and then just said, I don't like doing it, and left. They really needed, that's very Eddie, right? And they really needed someone. And so I became the guy. And then my nephew, Cider, who's now watching, this is him. This is him, the kid on the front there.
That's awesome.
Poor old Cider, he's possessed by a demon. It's great.
Awesome.
So I got into comics because I broke in. And the one thing about me writing Hellblazer, Kev, was that I wanted to write about where I was from. And it was a bit more authentic, frankly, about Britain than maybe even what Garth had done, because a lot of that was all London and stuff like that. But I grew up in the countryside, man, and I just really felt that the British countryside and the magic of it was a really important story to tell. And so I did I'm going to find a few more. We got loads of different ones. These I'm going to go through my stuff in a second. But I did Hellblazer, and I loved it, and I was very lucky to have a chance to do it. And
well, so you had some great artists that you work with. I mean, fabric covers and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, Sean Phillips, right, was my artist, and he's incredible. Yeah. So a couple of stories for anybody. We have a little echo, by the way, I'm told. Kev, it might be your volume if you could turn it down a little bit.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Hopefully we lost it. Good. Maybe.
Really loud.
Yeah, it might be your volume a bit. Okay. So this is my first. This is something that's very special to you and I. I don't know if you know this story. So sometimes, yeah, I think it might be coming from your laptop. So I think we lost it now. Okay. So you know the story of Swamp Thing 88. Why don't you tell our viewers the story of what happened with Alan Moore and Swamp Thing 88?
Well, it was actually Swamp Thing 88 was Rick Veitch.
Rick Veitch. I'm sorry. Yeah, Rick Veitch.
Yeah, no, there's a lot because because we all know Alan. We're talking about Alan, but Alan's the one that Steve Bissett and John Toberman have brought. I think they were a couple issues away from canceling Swamp Thing, and those guys came in and just revolutionized not only the character but almost comics in general. But Rick Veitch is just a super clever writer and artist, and was offered early on taking over Swamp Thing, and he had mapped out a year's worth of issues, which was basically this time travel story where Swamp Thing would go back in time. Each issue would be further back in time to the point where Swamp Thing 88 was he was actually part of the wood that was the cross that they crucified Christ on, and it was approved in advance, and so he methodically went through issue to issue to issue, and around the time they were getting, just you didn't always work a bit in advance, and around the time that he had done the cover, Tom Sutton was the inker, and he had penciled the entire issue, and I think Sutton had inked about a third of it, and then again, this was still 3 months before the issue would even come out, and I think DC had some interest in the Swamp Thing movie, and suddenly got very nervous and just didn't want the movie to not go ahead because of something controversial of Swamp Thing being part of the cross of Christ, and so they canceled the issue.
Yeah,
and it was basically dropped in mid pen stroke. Was it Tom Sutton or Michael Zulli? Michael Zulli was doing.
Yeah, I can't remember who drew it. Well, I got like a story that I don't actually know if you know this. So when I took over Hellblazer, I didn't like that story. I thought that was really hypocritical to basically cancel something because you thought that it was, and I'll tell you why I think it's hypocritical. If John Constantine can spend all this time looking at talking to the devil and talking to demons and all that, and you can't put Christ in the story, that's really hypocritical. I thought that was silly. Well, I got in Hellblazer '97. I got to write the first appearance of Jesus Christ back in a Vertigo book. They didn't know it was Jesus Christ until they realized what was happening at the end of the book. And I didn't tell them, so I was really rebellious, and I actually put Jesus in a story. And it's this guy right here. This is a character that was based on somebody that I knew when I was a kid. It was a gypsy. We lived out in the country, and the story is that John Constantine goes down and he finds in a forest, he finds this gypsy called Tom, and he talks to him, and the guy does basically like tarot cards, but they're like British countryside kind of earth cards. And John says, well, what do you do for a living? And he says, I'm a shepherd. And he said, well, don't you need a flock for that? And he says, well, I can see mine from anywhere. So really it was Jesus, like the shepherd or whatever. And we put him in. So I sneakily got a little of my friends back a little bit, because I'm quite friendly with each. And so I thought that was actually worth doing. So I ended up getting my stuff in Hellblazer. That was cool. And then I did, and this is an interesting one for you, by the way. This is actually a cool story. You get that question a lot, which is, where do you get your ideas from? Normally you don't know, right? It just kind of comes, right? But I was running around a cemetery where I used to run in Northampton, where we lived, right? So I was running around a cemetery, and as I'm running, I realized, wait a minute, I'm running anti-clockwise around a cemetery. And there's an old Scottish legend that's called Widdershins. If you go 3 times clockwise, anti-clockwise around a cemetery, the ghosts will come and haunt you. So as I'm running, I'm like, fuck. I've run around this thing like 70 times. I'm screwed. So I figured the only way to solve it was to write a story about a poor jogger that didn't realize why his life was screwed up by demons and stuff. And it was because every day he ran the wrong way around a cemetery. It's crazy, right? And then I was lucky enough to do the 10th anniversary issue of Hellblazer when in my run. And
how many did you write in the end?
I wrote more issues of Hellblazer than anyone that's ever written it.
Oh, no kidding! That's awesome.
Yeah. I wrote 5 years, I think, of it, and So what was cool about that issue was that in Hellblazer, he's got an internal monologue, and he basically, John Constantine talks to you like, yeah, I'm doing this and I'm doing that. This is the one where you go to the pub, and it's the pub where he tells you, the reader, the stories. And so you go in and he said, come on in and sit with me. And then all of the creators are the people drinking in the pub. And then he takes you around to meet everybody and shows you, where his life is. And then at one point in the comic, he says, I realize that I'm just black ink on white paper, but I'm also real. I'm as real as you want me to be. And the reason that I wrote that is because a lot of people have said that they've met John Constantine, and I've seen him too. And I know it sounds crazy, but I had an experience seeing him. Rick Veitch said he saw him. Alan Moore said he met him in a sandwich shop and then in his kitchen. And so I wanted to talk about that maybe if we believe in something a lot, it makes it true. And so one thing that's really funny is I'm writing all these like heady mental stories, and that really wasn't superheroes, man. That was like really different from the kind of stuff that I ended up doing.
And then, I think he was one of the lawyers that represented Mirage back in the day.
What was that?
John Constantine, I think he represented.
Yeah, maybe so.
That was Fred Fierce, somebody else.
Fred Fierce, yeah, right, absolutely. Yeah. And then for me, I was lucky, right? I had no idea, like I said, that I was going to do this job. And then the next thing I know, I'm like working in comics, and I didn't plan on it. And I get this phone call from Marvel, and they're like, hey, would you come work with us? And I said, yeah. And I go to Marvel, and they're in bankruptcy, man. They're going out of business. And so they said, well, we know you write clever comics. Can you do one? And I wrote this book called The Inhumans, which was their biggest giveaway. Like the characters that they'd never been able to sell. So they asked me, can you do it? And I went, yeah. And we won an Eisner Award. And that surprised the hell out of them. It was crazy.
No, that's great. It's funny just when you were talking about Hellblazer before, because I think we had intersected a number of different projects that we were working on, but we would talk a lot about what you were doing, and I love the source of the ideas because it was very. It seemed a lot of the Hellblazer ideas that you came up with were very personal and very I think Richard, like you were putting people you knew in instances you knew and legends, and you really found a voice, a way to express yourself the way you did in those comics. And then it's funny, when you went to Marvel, I was immediately jealous because you then wrote one of my favorite Jack Kirby Stan Lee creations, which is the Inhumans. Yeah. It was one of those characters, just Black Bolt, and just so many Lockjaw and everything. It was so cool. And then you also got to work with Jay Lee. Was really, I think he was not quite legendary, but he was like one of those guys that was a huge fan favorite at that time. So. But yeah, I love that series.
Yeah, and so I did. I got to see you later, Nolan. I got to work with Jay, and the very first thing that happened was we had this tremendous success. I mean, Marvel Knights went off, the rails, and I remember when it happened too. It wasn't issue 1, it was issue 2. It was like we came out with issue 2 about some kids, and it's like, the internet exploded, like, wow, it was just a comic. And next thing you know, they're like, this is the best thing ever. And then they said to me, you can write whatever you want, which is kind of cool, right? And I'll be honest, I didn't want to write Spider-Man because I thought it was a mess. And so I asked him, can I do the Sentry? Which is crazy because I had been pitching this bloody comic to them for years. And they had said no to me constantly. Every time I asked them, can I do the Sentry? They're like, no. I pitched it at DC. They said no. And it actually came originally because I wanted to do the Hour Man. Do you know that character for DC?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah,
he takes a pill and he's powerful for an hour. And I'm like, man, I'd be so addicted to that. I wanted to do a story about addiction. Yeah. They wouldn't let me do it. So I created the Sentry. They rejected it. Marvel rejected it so many times. And then when I had a little bit of power at Marvel and they said, you can do whatever you like, I said, I want to do the Sentry, and it really pissed them off.
Because I think they want to take over one of their own creations. And sort of
That's right. That's right. They wanted me to take over Spider-Man, and I said, I can't do it. I don't know what to say. It don't make any sense, right? I couldn't work out what Spider-Man, like I wouldn't have known what story to tell, right? So then,
that would have been a hard one.
Yeah, it was hard because it was so convoluted, and they had the Clone Saga and all this other stuff, and I couldn't understand any of it, right? So after the Sentry, that's when they let me do Spider-Man, and I ended up doing it with Mark Buckingham, and that was really lucky because Bucky is like incredible. Like he's an incredible artist, and
yeah, he's like one of those guys that I felt like when he came in with a style that then was so accessible and was sort of like this, hyper cartoony little dash of anime.
Yep.
And it just was, Bruce Timmey, Batman. I don't know. It was just
Yep.
agglomeration of a lot of really fun art styles that I think then was replicated many times by a lot of different artists. Really, grafted onto.
The thing about Bucky, and this is kind of a cool thing, is when I took over, when I did our first book, what happened was I called Bucky up, and it was late at night for me, so maybe 3 a.m, and it was 8 o'clock in the morning for him in Great Britain, and we had just come off successfully being on the front page of the Sun newspaper because they wrote about us taking over Spider-Man.
Uh-huh.
And we ended up talking about Spider-Man, and we had not done any work yet, and we both agreed, like, when I was a kid, he used to piss people off. He used to have a really funny sense of humor, and so that's what we wanted to do. We just wanted to kind of have him have a sense of humor, right? That's what I mean. Aren't those the Spider-Man issues that you remember when you were a kid, like Spider-Man being a kid and punching Dr. Octopus and stuff like that? That's what we wanted to do. So I was lucky enough to do Spider-Man. And then,
you had quite a run. How long was your run on that? Because you did a bunch of
6 years.
6 years. And it's like I have waited till they came out with the collections, but I've had a lot of the collections.
Yeah,
a couple of different artists as well.
Yeah, I did 6 years of it, and I was really cool. I got to work with Humberto Ramos a while, and obviously Humberto and I became friends, and we did some other work. But we did a story that was quite a definitive, like Green Goblin story that they ended up using in their first movie, and they called me up and said, "Hey, good news, we're using your story. Or Raimi really likes it. Bad news, we can't give you credit."
Of course not. I was like, that might. And leave them hanging out there for some legal claim
That's right. And so they did that to me a lot, man. They used my animals in the Hulk. They used and for me, it got to this culmination, right? Which was I was really lucky. And then at one point I'm at their editorial conference, and this is how it came down, right? So their president looked at me and said, "Why are you annoyed?" And I said, "Well, I'll be honest with you. You're supposed to be the house of ideas, and you keep saying no to every good idea that comes up today. Why is it that you keep saying no?" And he said, "I agree with you, and I would like you to tell me what the problem is." And my idea was, if Grant Morrison does Arkham Asylum, which is a great book, if he pitches Arkham Asylum 2, DC say no. It's almost like their default is to say no to anything. And Marvel's default was to say no. And I said, why can't you just say yes to stuff? And so I pitched them, would you be open to, why don't we do like the origin of Wolverine? You say we can't do it, but why don't we do it? And to Bill's credit, he said, sure. So I found myself writing the origin of fucking Wolverine, which was great because I didn't know anything about Wolverine.
That was right off the heels of the Spider-Man run.
That's right. I did Spider-Man and I did the Hulk. They let me rebuild that content. Then, so Joe Quesada always used to say to me, "You're like our rebuild guy. You rebuild our stuff. When we broke it, you fix it," kind of thing, which is nice to hear. But part of my answer would be, well, stop breaking it then.
Well, you know what's interesting is it me just made me think again. We talked about Alan Moore a bit earlier on, and um, just seems like around the time that he came into Swamp Thing, it was like he's some crazy Brit guy that wants to do a Swamp Thing story, and we're gonna cancel it in 3 issues. So do whatever you want, and then
That's right.
look what happened. And I think that when Marvel in a situation around the time that all the Marvel, all you Marvel nice guys that sort of came in, I think it was sort of like, well, what do we get to lose? Let's take some chances and make it work. And then and that's what sort of brought this interesting, um, not rebuild is not because that was sort of came later, but just sort of renewal, revival. It was a fresh look with fresh eyes with people that they said, well, what do we get to lose? Let's let this happen. But then the flip side of that, the worst part of that is that creates success, which then creates something more precious that then they have to sort of protect it. So then everything becomes no because they're getting really scared. Like, okay, we built it up to here. If we say yes to something, and it could tip it all over. Oh.
It is always crazy to me, Kev, right? That the freedom that we should enjoy as creators and the support and the trust that we should enjoy immediately is the first thing that's in jeopardy when it starts getting good. Because ultimately, when I first went there, they were in bankruptcy, man. They were so close to Chapter 7 bankruptcy. And then when we had success and they finally did the last thing that you ever think they're going to do, which is to let good creators actually make good content, they turn around and they say, no, you can't do that. And you're like, why? What are you talking about? I'm telling you right now that we did a little project called Civil War, right? I worked on Civil War, and Mark Miller was writing the main title. And what most people don't know about that book is that I had 11 issues of Civil War Frontline, and it was the man on the street kind of story, right? I'd written 11 issues of that book before Mark had written issue 2. So what you see in Civil War is very much a story that I wrote.
Oh, wow.
And because Mark was really sick, Mark Miller was really sick at the time. And so he was struggling. And so they would have me hand in mine. And so really that's the way the story was going to go. And I'll never forget that, they never touched a single word of Civil War, not once. I would write it and they would say, that's great. You can just keep it as it is. We love it. And you're doing a great job. Thanks very much. And Civil War Frontlines, I believe, sold, they said, like 4 or 5 times what they thought it was going to sell. So we were doing great. Thanks very much. And then they had me do the next one, which was Frontlines World War Hulk, which was their very next. They did some next, event. And I started working on it, and they started telling me, you need to do this, you need to do that. And they started telling me the rules. And I'm like, why the hell are you telling me what to write now? You've never done that. I've done this for 6 or 7 or 8 years with you and everything's fine. And now you're telling me what you think I should do. I don't understand. And you know what? It was like a year and a half before they sold to Disney. And that's when you realize what was going on. They needed to tell me because the stakes were high now,
Yeah, they started to get worried. It's like the stupid, exactly. Protecting the franchise, protecting because it is, they're building it, it's been built up to now. It was a reputable company again. It was popular and selling loads of comics.
Yeah. To which I say, you're welcome, Marvel. No problem.
Well, it's unfortunately, it's one of those kinds of stories that we all wish didn't repeat itself as much as it is, whether it's in our business or similar creative businesses that it's like even we're working through we're doing some great stuff with Tom Waltz and I working on this last Ronin story based on a story that Peter and I wrote. But it was one of those things that Tom Waltz wrote 100 issues. He spent 9 years. He wrote 100 spectacular issues of the Turtles, and it was and it's it takes a village in the sense that you get really fantastic artists, and Nickelodeon had some input, and Bobby Curnow is a series editor. But at the end of the day, it's like every single one of those was written by Tom. He was in the driver's seat, and so when they were gearing up to getting to issue 100, it was sort of like, well, we're gonna, you've done 100 issues. we're going to try some other things. And he's just sort of like, so he was just sort of like, well, can I do this? And I still want to do stuff. What do you want me to do? And they're sort of like, well, thanks. You wrote 100 issues. That's great. And it wasn't, I not want to make it sound like they completely dismissed them, because we had been talking about Last Runner for the year before, but it was one of those moments where, like you spending, 5 years on Hellblazer, or 6 years on Spider-Man, or 8 years as a company man, and suddenly there's sort of like literally, because he edits some other books as well, but he sort of was sitting in his office and was just sort of like, well, I just spent 9 years writing 100 issues. What am I supposed to do now? And it was a moment of giving your sea legs again, and it's and I think it's that corporate structure sometimes that
I don't mind it. I don't mind it, buddy, because I'll be honest with you, man. I kind of get it. They're corporations, Like, look, my background was with you. Like, my foundation in this business was with you, especially Tundra, right? And as crazy as Tundra was a cool, amazing movement, right? It was telling creators, yes, you can, and you're worth it, and you deserve the chance to own your content and to benefit from it. Now, listen, you and I are going to get into Tundra in a couple of weeks, and that story is fucking whack. Okay, that's the wackiest story of all time. And there are going to be some
good ones.
But what Tundra really represented was beautiful, right? It was letting creators own their content and benefit from it. Why did you want to do that? Because you and Pete did, right? You guys had the opportunity to do it. And the very first thing, like I've said on this show many times, the reason I love you, buddy, is because you said how lucky you were. You didn't say, I did this and I'm really cool. Almost the first time I met you, you went, look how lucky I was. I got to own my content, right? Let's be clear, everybody out there. Kevin wasn't just lucky. Okay, you guys stood up for yourselves, and you guys turned down a lot of money at one point for various things, right? Yeah. And that's hard to do when you're not rich, right? And someone goes, I'll give you $1 million. And you go, and you turn that kind of thing down. That's pretty hard. But Tundra Publishing meant something, and it's what I took with me. So when I was working with Marvel and when I was rebuilding their content and their value, I didn't care. I already knew that I was going to be moving on. I knew it, man. I didn't expect, I was expecting to move on because I wasn't their guy. I wasn't an insider. I didn't do politics. I didn't know anything about it. I was just going to end up moving on. And so around about 2002, I got back to what I was expecting to do. As I started working with Rob Pryor, remember? Yeah. And I started working with him in Los Angeles, and we started trying to do film. And I wanted to get out of Marvel, and I was working on game design, and I was doing video games. And that to me was what I was always going to do anyway. And so when I look at these things, I look at Tundra Publishing, as difficult as that was, and I go, yeah, man, that was awesome. Those days were crazy, and they broke our heart a little bit, but we were trying to do the right thing. Whereas working for a giant corporation like Warner Brothers or Sony or Disney, Marvel, you're going to do the work, you're going to bring value to them, and then they're going to have the value. And so I never felt worried. In all of this, I've had some real luck, right? Look, I got to write Wolverine Origin. I got to write Spider-Man for 6 years. I got to write all of these things. So let's lighten it up a little bit. This is a cool question for you because I know what mine is. In fact, I'll go first, and then I'd love to hear from you. The question is, what was your favorite thing that you ever wrote, right? Or that you ever drew, or your favorite issue or whatever, and why, right? So think about it for a second, and let me tell you what mine is, because mine is very surprising. I was lucky enough to, at one point, I worked on a project called Mythos, right? And Mythos was a fully painted reimagining of the origins of Marvel. So they would let me get the original story, usually by Stan and Jack, or Jack and Joe Simon, or whomever, and then we would paint them, and they were beautiful. Paulo Rivera is the artist, and my God, the art is absolutely beautiful in those books, right? And at one point, I wrote one about Captain America, and it's fully painted. And I put my next door neighbor, who was a survivor of the USS St. Louis. He was the main character in it. He was Captain America's buddy from when he was a kid. And I loved it so much, and it was so popular that the editor, Tom Brevoort, called me up and he asked me, okay, do you want to do more Captain America? And I said, yeah, I'd love to do more Captain America, because I love the character. And so I wrote 4 issues of a book called Captain America: Theater of War. And all I can say about them is, if you read them, you'll cry your eyes out. It's like, I don't care who you are, you'll get weepy, because it's all about the plight of the common soldier. It's very much about my family. I wrote a lot about my great grandfathers, and they, you know, they lost their lives in the First War. I wrote 1 issue about one of my best friends, Brian Anderson, who's a triple amputee who survived his injuries in Iraq. And so writing about soldiers in the military always makes me cry. Always does. Like, I'm a big weepy soft bastard when it comes to it. My favorite work that I ever did at Marvel or anywhere, my favorite mainstream work was Captain America. And so when I get to the end of this relationship with Marvel, I don't really do mainstream. I still can look back and go, man, I'm proud of that. You know, I love working on that stuff. Right?
Yeah, I gotta look at it. I feel like I know I have that in my collection, but I definitely gotta look at that again. But this is what time period did this come out?
So this was about 2007 or 8. It was Mythos. This is actually an image from Mythos, right? What I'll do is let me show you the Captain America: Theater of War. That's this one. This is the actual book I'm talking about. I got to work with John McCrae. He was amazing. And the stories were progressively. I'll tell you how it came out, right? When I got a call from Tom Brevoort, and he asked me, can you write Cap? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, can you pitch me these oversized books called Theater of War? We want single issue stories, and we know you love them. And I waited for half an hour, and I called him up and I said, Tom, I got 4 stories for you. And we ended up publishing every single one of them. It took me half an hour to think of them. And I told him the first one that's in this series. And when I told it to him, Tom Brevoort on the phone at the other end of the line, he let out a little laugh, Kevin. And I said, Tom, I know what you're doing. You cried then, didn't you? And he said, you bastard. I've been doing this for 35 years and you just made me cry. And I said, great, man. So those are the ones that I'm most proud of. They will make you cry. They're very poignant, and they're very much about my family and my friends who've been in the military. You know, and having survived a little bit of the military myself in the Air Force Reserve or cadets, you know, if you've ever been exposed to the military, there's a love in the military for brothers and sisters that is unlike any other, you know. And I can tell you, you know, on firsthand experience, like, my contribution to the British military was putting my arms through the middle of a dead sheep. Long story. That's what we got. But, you know, standing around doing hard things, going through drill, standing on a cold drill thing, just having each other's back, it's hard. And so writing about that is really cool. That's mine. What about you?
Well, what I love what you said is, what you're talking about is, it was an interesting thing that, because I've always been fascinated by history and what history, big part of history is war. And so I remember, like, I'd read war comics, and then, you know, read books on World War I, World War II, and I was just, you know, Vietnam and Korea and these things, and people, you know, have this idea where, or, you know, the Spartans, and it was just one of those things that people think, well, you're just a warmonger, and it's like, no, I'm not a warmonger. I don't like war. I don't promote war. I don't want to. War is a very cruel. It's just the most despicable thing in the world. But what's interesting is that, to me, the fascinating part is the heroes, the people that, you know, yes, any veteran that survived, you know, I have an uncle that was second wave at Omaha Beach, and, you know, and any veteran will tell you that survived those wars, that all the heroes that particular battle, of that war, were left on the beaches or left in the fields or left over there. They didn't get a chance to come home. And so it was the idea of the hero that would, against all odds, against the fear and the things that the scariest thing in the world, which is dying, to help your brothers, to help to stand up for the things that you felt were right and doing the right thing. That to me was the commendable thing. I grew up in the great state of Maine, and we grew up with Joshua Chamberlain, who was a very famous Civil War commander that helped spotted the weakness at Little Round Top in the Battle of Gettysburg and helped save that battle and potentially helped save the war, so to speak. So it was more the idea. So that was what fascinated me about I mentioned the war comics I was reading that Joe Kubert was editing, which was not only the Make War No More symbol, but a lot of the stories that they were crafting and writing were, about the camaraderie, the brotherhood, the sacrifice, and all those things. And that's what.
Yeah, man. And I got like a really cool kind of okay, so I love Karen Berger. I'm so reverent towards Karen. She's amazing. I mean, she gave me my first job as a writer, and I love her. She's incredible. But there's kind of a funny story about, I wrote a story for Weird War Tales.
I love Weird War Tales.
Okay. They did it with Vertigo, and they asked me for a story, and I literally wrote a story that was based on a real event. That not only was it a real event, but my great uncle Charlie was in. He was lost on the Battle of the Somme. So again, like poor old Charlie Hazelgrove, he bit it. They never found his body, but he was right in a very famous battle that was a very big tragedy in British military history. The morning of the Somme offensive, a colonel came down the line, and the way that the battle was supposed to go is they would make the soldiers march across no man's land, and right in front of them would be the shelling pattern. So they would shell the ground, and the guys would run behind it. So they knew the Germans would take about 5 minutes to winch up their heavy equipment, right? And they figured, as the Germans are busy winching this up, we can go and overrun their trenches. We're going to win this battle. And the colonel said, no, you're not going to do that, because British soldiers do not run, they march. And literally, the poor soldiers had to walk across, they had to march across no man's land. The Germans winched up their equipment, probably said, like, what the hell are they doing there? And they shot them and killed them all. My great uncle Charlie Hazelgrove was in that battle. That's so sad. So I wrote the story from the perspective of the captain who's leading his men across no man's land, and he's been told this, and in his head he's thinking, I've got to tell him to run, but because he has orders, he cannot tell him. So Karen said, why doesn't he just tell him to run? And I kept saying, Karen, you'd understand if you've been in the military, like you can't go against your orders, as stupid as they would be. That's kind of the point of what happens. She didn't like it. Frankly, I just handed in the same script 2 weeks later, and they said, okay, it's approved. So that was really sneaky of me. But I wrote that in Weird War Tales, like literally based on a real person. So, stories can come from real life experiences as well as your imagination, man. I mean, they should. And
yeah, I think that's some of the scary stuff about those kinds of stories, is that something that is is that real, that people think is it's hard to believe. Peter Weir did a pretty fantastic version of Gallipoli, with the Anzacs and what happened there, and stuff that, and some of the things that they would show in these battles, and it's always like, to me, and just the historical stuff that I've read and grown to understand of certain battles and how it evolved and this and that. It was all too often you'd see, like, by the time World War I started, the military tactics were far outdated. They were a war that was 20 years old. That the generals that were commanding them in those days, they weren't going up against machine guns, so they still felt massing their men and marching them. And I just read another book on World War I again recently, and actually, French artist named Tardy did René Tardy did a really fantastic series of events based on his father's stories of World War I, the French military. But it was, they completely antiquated systems. And you have some of those battles where you could lose 15,000 Germans, and you could lose 15,000 British, French, whatever. Have 30, 40, 50,000 person losses in a single battle was not unusual.
On the Somme, dude, on the Somme, they believe 80,000 casualties on both sides on the first day of the Somme offensive. That's 80,000 people, 80,000 casualties. That's incredible, And so,
yeah,
I think we got onto this because I was so proud of those books, and writing about military and writing about war is something. And I got one little aside. I also do game design, and I worked on this game called The Darkness. It was one of my favorite games I ever did. And we did a series that was set in the trenches. You actually go through some of the levels and you go through the trenches. And so I put my great grandfathers all in one section of one of the trenches. And what you do is you walk across the no man's land and you get to the trenches, and they walk across. And my great grandfather, Bill Eldridge, says, "Hi, I'm Captain Bill Eldridge of the British Expeditionary Force." He wasn't a captain, by the way. He was a corporal, private, I think, actually. But when I played the first build of the game, I walked across no man's land and I found my great grandfathers, and I couldn't go. I couldn't move on. So I hung out with them for hours. I just sat there. I didn't do anything.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, very heartfelt in an awesome way.
It was really cool. And they're like a little bit alive now, they live in a game, right? So yours, man, I know we got sidetracked, but we always do, you and I. What about your favorite copy, your favorite work of your own? Like, what was your favorite thing that you did?
I guess I'd probably go, Peter and I, of course, but I go back to some of my favorite turtle stories. It was sort of one of those things that depending on the idea that how it would evolve, it was just always an interesting process. I mean, so some stories I might take a bit more of a lead in. Stories like one of my favorite issues that Peter did took the lead on was a Donatello one shot, which was the Kirby online and stuff. But I had the idea for the Casey Jones, the one shot with Raphael. On that time in comic books, they were doing 4-issue miniseries when that came out, 4-issue miniseries. And I said, well, if they can do 4-issue miniseries, why don't we do a 1-issue micro series, and each issue would feature an individual turtle. And so the first one, I had this idea about Raphael, that if he met somebody that was crazier than he was, would it sort of help him look inward a little bit and say, well, maybe I should tone it down or whatever. And so that was the introduction of the creation and the introduction of Casey Jones. And that was one of my favorites. The next one was, I love them all in so many different ways, of course. We all love our stories for different reasons. One of the highlights for me was working with Dave Sim. And it was, when I say working with him, I had an idea to do a Cerebus Turtles crossover in Turtles issue 8. So I was such a huge Cerebus fan. And so this is one of those stories that I took a bit more of the lead in. It was actually the story ended up being 45 pages long. And I pitched Dave the idea, and I think he was, he wanted to do it, but he was sort of like, I kind of inspired these guys, and they're selling, 10 times as many comics as I am. And so he agreed to do it because we seldom would give him 50% of the royalties. And he said he'd donate all of them to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which I think the issue sold almost 100,000 copies of a black and white comic book, and his royalty was very large. And I think he said years later, he said that was the hardest thing I had to do was write that, endorse that check over in its entirety because it was such a good thing. But it was a great story. I really loved everything that happened in that story. But one of my personal favorites that I did on my own, wrote it and penciled. I worked with Eric Talbot for penciling and inking, but it was a story that I fully wrote on my own. Was Turtles issue 14. It was called The Unmentionables, and I had just seen the Untouchables movie with Kevin Costner and Sean Connery and that, and it just was sort of one of those things that, like a superhero, especially like the Turtles, are that they go out there and they do these things and solve the crimes and or save the day, and they're tiny little corner of the universe, but they're not recognized for it. So they're basically unmentionable. They do
Yeah.
this kind of thing. And it was, so it was, the name was borrowed that. So I had like this Slovakian gangsters come in, and there was this legend of this, was based on a variety store that I used to work in Westbrook, Maine. It was called Louis Variety. It had a rival sandwich shop, a grocery store, deli place that was called Nicely's Market. Nicely's had a big plastic cow on the roof, and these college kids stole it. These college kids stole it as a prank and then hid it somewhere, and they found it later. So I sort of had this thing where the gangsters had brought this cow from Slovakia. All this gold was hitting on it. And it was stolen off this roof. And this whole thing was running around. I had guys like, Norman Whitty and local. It was just, by then the Turtles had been completely relocated to Northampton, Massachusetts, from New York City. And so it was zany. It was cool. And Casey was pretending he was a detective. And, April, I sort of played it up as his Girl Friday. And it was just a fun little romp that was probably one of the first ones I wrote completely, sort of soup to nuts by myself, and it was just fun, silly, looking inward, like bringing memories of persons or childhood things or things we write from what we know, and that's
right. You write kind of about yourself for your audience, right? You write what you know, yeah. This question that Jasny is asking us, right, which leads me to another quick question. Is it true that the two muggers that Casey Jones beats up in the Raphael one shot were based after you and Pete?
Yes.
Yes. That's cool.
Because it was what I love is you look at them, and for some reason we were a lot muscular.
Yeah, they were based on you and Pete. They weren't you and Pete. Hey, have you ever been in your own comics, or have you ever been a character in comics? In a comic that you know of, or in the Ninja Turtles or whatever? Have you been a character? Like Kevin Eastman is a character?
Only, we just did that recently. In a series that we did a Kickstarter for in 2017, and then again in 2019. It's called Drawing Blood.
Yeah.
And Drawing Blood is an idea that I had started probably about, you'll relate to this very well. That I had the idea about 10 years ago, and it was, I keep the sketchbook diary. It was sketches and little anecdotes, and it was stuff that either a personal experience that I had in comics in Hollywood, publishers at conventions, those kind of things. But to me, it was always like, and this is probably, again, you can relate to so well. It's like when a comic book convention is over, 99% of the time, you're either going out to dinner with other creators, you end up at the hotel bar. The stories are told, and of course, as the drinks get, the night gets longer and the drinks get stacked up, the stories get better. And there's such great anecdotes, and like you said, we'll get into some of the crazy fun of that.
First of all, you get more handsome, and you can fly, and you're invincible. So yeah, I know those things. Yeah.
So I started adding these anecdotes to this the sketchbook diary I was keeping, and it evolved into, I said, I want to do a story here, and I'm feeling it could be an interesting movie, kind of like Spinal Tap, where it would have a character that had huge amount of success, that created a kid's property, wasn't as wise with his money, did the rock star, sports star, comic star thing, and lost this and that, and he's sort of digging his way back, but he's haunted by his characters and past bad decisions and things. And when developing, and the original idea, as I called it, was On the Shoulders of Giants, and I had met David Avalone in a bar at Emerald City Comic Con, and we talked about everything else but Russ Heath comics and all this kind of stuff. And then we were hanging out again at San Diego Comic Con in 2015. Just we just sort of hit it off, like-minded thing, and I just said, you can relate to this. I know you worked in the movie industry and you're doing some comic stuff now, but I had this idea, and I told him about On the Shoulders of Giants, and he really got into it. He said, "Oh my God, you could do so much with it." And I said, "You see the autobiographical element that'll be part of it, but if you do it as a completely fictional true story, you create a character, then you can push him further, dig deeper, do crazier things with that character." So we were just sort of walking. I was heading over to back to the convention center to do a panel, and as we kind of got to the door, and he goes, "You know what you should call it? You should call it Drawing Blood, because it is like giving birth and drawing blood." So we quickly became my idea, became our idea. He's officially the co-creator, but it's set in the world of comic books. I'm in that world. You're in that world. Everybody we know in the world of comic books is in the world of Shane Bookman.
Here it is, like coming alive, right? Here's the world of that comics are so alive, you know. Here they are.
So this is Shane and his brother Paul created a comic called the Radically Rearranged Ronin Ragdolls, which are 3 samurai cats that grew up over sushi. They mutated and they grew up over a sushi restaurant in Queens. They're all named after famous Japanese animators, Tezuka, Miyazaki, and Otomo. And so Shane Bookman and his brother self-published it in 1991 in their homage to Kevin and Peter and this stuff. So in this first volume 1, there's a scene where Shane's going into a panel at New York City Comic Con, and he meets me. We met before, and he goes, "Hey," and I'm like, "Hey, Shane, how's it going?" He's like, "Oh, good, Kevin. I have to do this panel," and you get this. The kind of the joke is, Morgan Harbour is the Hollywood producer who's making the radically dark, reimagined version of the radically dark version of the Rain. Ragdoll.
What was his name again?
Not Michael Bay. It's Morgan Harbour.
Yeah, Morgan Harbour. No, I got the joke. I just thought it was brilliant. Morgan Harbour.
So the thing is that, like, Morgan Harbour has brings Shane to this panel because Morgan has announced that the Ragdolls are going to be aliens and not going to be mutants like they were in the original comic book. Which is what Michael Bay did with the Turtles. Using the Turtles. So anyway, we have an exchange, and David's there, Ben Bishop, the series artist, and Troy Little's one of the others. But we get time. So this one is really fun because it is very meta in that the things that experiences that I've had, and including experiences with you and other people that we all know in comic books, have all sort of been merged into the completely fictional true story of Shane Bookman.
And we've had a few, but I really want to talk to you a little bit more about this because Kickstarter, right? I found it to be a really pure form of publishing that harkened way back to the way that we began this. Certainly I did with Tundra. Kickstarter is great, right? You've had Drawing Blood. I think you've currently got Drawing Blood now, yeah. Drawing Blood 2 was the one that's current, yeah.
Yeah, we did. 2017 was the one that kicked it off. It was the first 4 issues because we imagined the series to be 12 issues. So it's the first 4,
okay,
plus a recreation of the 1991 Ragdolls comic book, and then we did the one in 2019 covers issues 5 through 8, and plus we did a 2-part Ragdolls animated special thing. And so we're hoping we can self-fund the rest of the series, but if not, we'll do a Kickstarter. But it's to probably take what you were just going to say away is you have the fan support to do a comic book that you have traded as a purest form of vision. It's you're the writer, you're the editor, you're whatever you want it to be, and at the end of the day, you still own it, and they've supported it and brought this to life. So it's
absolutely. And then you got, I know you told me off camera, you told me that you have another one. Have you announced it yet? Or are you saying, because I know you want to do another one, right?
Yeah, we want to do another one. It's up a property that I created many years ago, but we haven't announced it yet, so we can save it.
I didn't say that. Didn't happen. Kevin doesn't Kickstarter. There's nothing going on. Forget I said it. Look at the man behind the curtain.
One of these, we're gonna have to come up with something on our own and do one or something.
That's right, brother. You know that. I've done a couple. I've been very lucky with Kickstarter because I loved it, but it also broke my heart. Right, it was really hard because we had some problems with the people doing the fulfillment for us. But you've seen this book, right? Do you know Fairy Quest? Yeah, okay. Fairy Quest is something that I've always been in love with, and I got to work with a good friend of mine, Humberto Ramos. We did Spider-Man together. But look, man, look at the crazy. Look at how this stuff looks, man. I mean, it's just
exquisite.
It's so exquisite. And so we've done 2 Fairy Quest. And I can sort of say that actually we're going to bring this back I never thought this book would come back because I didn't think we'd be able to get back to it. We're going to bring it back. I think in about 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to do a Kickstarter for it because I can't stand it not living, man. It's so beautiful. And
well, what was the result of the Kickstarters? Was it individual issues or a miniseries?
No, they were beautifully bound 56-page books.
Wow.
They're super nice, and you know why the story basically is the story of Red Riding Hood and the Wolf, and they are supposed to be enemies, and they live in a world called Fablewood, and they're supposed to be enemies, but they've broken the rules. They're actually best friends. Look at the picture at the end; it's so beautiful, right?
his artist, that guy just is such a fantastic artist.
Yeah, Umberto was great, and I'm actually doing it with a guy, a different artist now, which we'll announce. You know, but he's just like Umberto, except he's got his own style, so it's still beautiful. And then I also did another one, and I may have told you about this years ago. I did this one called Fiction Squad that's set in the same world, and the premise of it is that all the worlds in Fablewood are all like, there's like the world of like crime stories and the world of horror stories and science fiction. And right in the middle of the children's stories. So there's a guy from the world of detective fiction, and he hasn't had a job in 100 years because he's been out of print. So he moves to where all the nursery rhymes are, because he realizes that every nursery rhyme is a crime scene.
Oh my God, that's funny. That's hilarious.
So this is the dish and the spoon, and they're running away. Like Itsy Bitsy Spider's a home invader. This is a bunch of numbers that they're chasing, like the Keystone Cops, because they're running numbers.
Oh my God.
And so this guy, Frankie, who's the detective, he moves to the world of nursery rhymes, and he finds out that the queens and the witches are the mob. So the Queen of Hearts is like Don Corleone, and they're all killing each other. And so someone drops a house on the Wicked Witch of the East, and there's a turf war between the queens and the witches, and this poor bastard gets stuck in the middle, and they give him Simple Simon is his partner. So there's Simon right in the middle of it there. So someone just put this up. Look here, I like this comment. The best thing about comics is the unlimited imagination it engenders.
Yeah.
That could not be more true. Like, people love Ninja Turtles because of one self-evident truth about Ninja Turtles, Kevin. When you're a kid, I can give you 4 Ninja Turtles and your imagination, and you can go. And Scott McCloud said this in Understanding Comics. He said, the story that we tell in comics is not really told in the images. Sure they are. You know, you see the two images kind of juxtaposed against each other, but really it's the gap in the middle. It's the panel border. That's where you're actually telling your story. It's all in your imagination.
Yeah. No,
and so we are so lucky to be able to do comics for a living. And, you know, it's nice to play with the toys of Spider-Man and Ninja Turtles I've had a chance to play with. You know, it's great to play with them, but in the end, nothing stops us from having a blank piece of paper and our imagination and making up a new story in about 2 minutes.
Yeah, and that goes right back to the start of our conversation in Jack Kirby. Is that was what fascinated me, is that it was all about the imagination. It's like if you can imagine it and you can write it or write it and draw it. Which was the appeal to me, is that you can go anywhere. It's limitless, and especially for, you know, depending on what the circumstances growing up in. Like, again, I was very, very small town. Downtown was a stop sign and a tiny little store that was also a gas station. But that didn't mean anything. Anything you can imagine, you could go, and that's a beautiful thing about.
Yeah, I wrote about that one time because I remember you had told me about that, and I grew up in the back end of nowhere in a caravan most of the time. You know, like, I didn't have anything, and one thing that I remember talking with you early on about, like, how really when you have a comic, now you're not in that shitty environment. You're transported to wherever that comic takes you, right? I wrote about that in a Spider-Man comic that I did with Paolo about a kid with cerebral palsy. And every night his family will take him up to the roof, and he can only sit there trapped inside his body. But like he says to the reader, yeah, but while they're busy downstairs, I'm upstairs flying. Like, he would fly in his imagination. And one night he gets to witness a fight between Spider-Man and Morbius, the living vampire.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this incredible world that he lives in. and then it all kind of comes back, and he just goes about his life again. But he's had this incredible experience, right? So
That's awesome.
comics are such a conduit. And then, we'll run a little long tonight because this is a really good conversation that I think we should have, which is what's happening now, right, in comics. Obviously the industry's closed down. Everybody's a bit worried and upset because of COVID. And, we hope everyone's staying safe and feeling okay mentally, because I'm sure that it's really hard for people with their emotions. But
Absolutely.
the comic industry is closed down, right? And right now, nothing's being done. It's kind of come full circle. Diamond are not shipping. The question really is, how's the content, right? Where's the content coming from? Where's the good content coming from? And as hard as it is to say, I love the medium. I love my friends who are comic book creators. I adore the opportunity to say hi to fans. But I've never been a big fan of the industry itself, man. It's so broken, because you've got small retailers trying really hard to stay above water, and they are trying really hard to pay the bills, and giant corporations that are sending content to them. That's pretty tough, man. That's a tough business to be in, because Marvel and DC and Diamond kind of dominate the way that the business works. It's great when the content is great, but when the content is substandard and mediocre and panders to people and all that, it's a shame. So my personal opinion is that the COVID thing, which is obviously, listen, COVID is not good in any way, shape, or form, but this resetting of the world might be good for the comic book industry. That's my opinion.
Well, yeah, no, I agree with so many parts of what you said. When I look at, like, say, the path that Peter and I had, say, with the comics, initially in the success because of the creation of the direct market distribution system at a time when there were, rumored to be between 5,000 and 6,000 comic book shops back in those days. We're talking like mid '80s, and it was like the things like the black and white boom and bust, where the shops suddenly became very profitable because they had lots of collectors, people from outside the comics come in, collect these books that might be worth a lot more than they were going to be worth ever, and it sort of drove the market up. And so people speculated, and when the market crashed, 2,500 shops went out of business. So now you got 3,500 shops, and then that slowly starts to rebuild itself, and then you end up with the color comics boom and bust when you had the explosion of Image Comics and things like that. Where Image, I remember talking to John Nee, who at that point was heading Wildstorm, and it's like they didn't even go to press on a comic book unless the orders were at least 1 million copies.
Yeah, crazy, right? Remember those days? Wow.
Yeah, remember those. And so then when that crashed, that had the same effect. That I think at least a minimum of half the comic stores in the country went out of business from speculation, loss of business. So it just came down to each time it sort of had these massive expansion and then contraction. What was left were the people that were reading them, that loved comic books for the art form that they were. And so when you have not long after the restriction of losing distributors like Heroes World and Capital City and stuff, and then you came down to just one singular distributor, then it's it borders on it borders on a lot of problematic.
Well, let me be less polite than you are, because you're always really polite, right? Yeah, it's fucking monopoly. It's a monopoly, man. Like, don't tell me that wasn't a monopoly. You got one distributor, that's a monopoly. And that's no fun, right? Because people can't get out of a monopoly. That means that they control the industry, and that's not good for anybody. So yeah.
No, so then you have these comic stores, and there's some exceptionally smart, comic book retailers who run great shops and have a say in the market and can help with the business. But they have the monopoly, and it's like they have a stranglehold. It's like working, back in the old mining or logging days when you're, beholden to the company store, so to speak, that, your livelihood of, they want to shut you off. If you don't get your Marvel and DC books, then you're out of business. And they can control those purse strings, and they can control other things that happen. So that was incredibly problematic just for it changes the marketplace so much so that it's harder for upcoming, interesting, independent, people like Oni and people that are sort of bringing in interesting ideas and different perspectives into the comic store. Suddenly you have one publisher, one distributor that can set limits on it. Well, if I don't get 1,500 copies and orders, for your particular book, then we're not even gonna put it through our system. So you can't, we'll put you in our catalog, but if it doesn't hit this level, then you can't. And so when you're passing that down the line, where you get this 250-page catalog that these retailers have to pick, budget their weekly spend on, sometimes you can't take a risk on some of these more specialty items or more interesting and diverse comic books because you just can't afford to keep it on the shelf. If it doesn't sell, then you're screwed. You can't pay your own rent.
Yeah, the job's made 50 times harder, Kevin, by the catalog and all of that, because you're a retailer, you're doing your best to diversify your product, but frankly, you can't diversify your product because you're trying to navigate your way through this giant catalog. You have to fight to bring in independent work, but that shouldn't be the way. Like, I grew up in Europe, man, so like superheroes were not mainstream comics. Like we had Asterix the Gaul and Tintin, and we had war comics, and everything was a comic, right? So we didn't expect it to be just superheroes. The American market is very much dominated by superheroes, and it's great because there's a place for them, but it's a shame because there should be other stuff. And so what's not mainstream is seen as mainstream, and all mainstream things like detective fiction and comedies and kids stuff, don't get us started on kids stuff, because kids material should be prominent. You should be making tons of kids material and letting kids come into comic stores, and there's nothing for kids, or very little.
Well, that's and again, it's this discussion alone could be a whole other session, because there is a lot of in a positive way, in an interesting way, because as we said when we started our very first session, is that you and I have been around, whether it be fan of or / intimately involved in the business for 32, 33, 35 years. So I've seen stuff, whether experiences with heavy metal, with the newsstand market and what's happened there, to what it's evolved to now, to what we see, what works, to the the fact that I've had friends in LA, Golden Apple Comics and Ryan and those guys. So it's like, if you're selling a $3.99 comic book or whatever, that's to pay rent on a store front in Los Angeles, you got to move a lot of freaking comic books to do that. So it is really it's challenging, and you have to be just savvy and smart and be able to negotiate the side gigs, which is people will have gaming components, or they'll have subscription services. They'll do all these things. Again, it's just to make enough living to pay your staff, to pay your rent, and have enough so you can go on vacation once a year with the family, usually to San Diego Comic Con.
Yep, and you know what, Kevin? I think the problem is that if you get that wrong, if you accidentally do too much gaming in your store, for example, you blow it up, and now suddenly it's not a comic store, and then it doesn't work right. Like, you have to fight really hard to get that to work correctly, and I think that's a shame, because the comic store is a place to go. It's like a cultural kind of place in the middle of our community. That's what it's all about, community, right? And so we're losing those right now, not because of COVID, but because we were losing them anyway. We were killing these retailers, and that's a shame. The retailers and the creators deserve to be right in the front and center, and yet they were getting marginalized by the business itself. That's a shame.
Yeah, it is a shame, because it is, because we're worried about all of our family, all of our friends, all of our loved ones, whether and when I think about the fans that we've had, whether it be I'm as much of a fan of Star Wars or Star Trek or Marvel Cinematic Universe or all those things, and you're thinking like you want to have the collectability aspect and enjoy those kind of things, but when suddenly you had this disruption that you had with it's global. I'm not whining in any sense. It's a global disruption, but you have the scenario, because people have that big discussion with the big question mark at the end, going, well, what's it going to be like when it comes back, when they finally reopen comic book stores and they start doing this stuff, start distributing comic books again and doing that? Well, all of the fans that were willing to stand in my line or go to my same comic store I go to, that were baristas or service staff or, did sort of just really basic jobs to support their families, do not have or will not have that ability to enjoy the things that they love, the fandom and the things, so that it's going to be a long, slow recovery period for everybody, for every part of the business. But it's sort of, I'm saying that again with that big question mark at the end, and so to see where we end up, and and that's why I think doing things like what we're doing right now, talking to the fans. We've been doing some stuff. Kevin Eastman Studios have been doing some really fun Facebook Live events just to be with the fans. I did a thing, watch TMNT with me. We're going to do another one May 15th. We're going to watch The Secret of the Ooze with our fans, and
that's great. I want to come watch with you. I'm just going to kind of join in. I'm going to go in the audience and watch it with you, man. Did you see?
Heck yeah, man!
Did you see
that
like Judith Hogue is one?
Yeah, well, what's funny is Judith was going to be. We were supposed to be doing a convention in Bangor, Maine. Home turf, bro. And Judith was going to be up there, and Ben Bishop and Troy Little was coming. It was going to be a great sort of turtle-based.
The gang back together. Judith Hogue, by the way, for anyone that may not know, was the original April in the first movie. But she's going to be doing a watch party, I think, coming up. She's actually I think they might be pivoting away from the watch party. So you've got a bunch of stuff going on Facebook, right? You've got like Facebook watch parties and meet the fans and all kinds of stuff that you're doing, which is cool. We do it too at Meta. We like to just kind of hang out with the fans and do that. What do you have coming up? What's coming up for you?
Well, that's it. That's kind of it, because I was just going to say, I love that you guys, the guys at Meta do that, because it's it's the only way we can hang out, and that was the thing that and not being selfish about it, is that one of the things we do, Courtney and I would do about 15 to 17 shows a year, and that was our favorite part, was going to some place that we've never been, meet fans that we've never met before, hear their stories. It was just it's be with like-minded, the camaraderie that we can now we're enjoying on these online gatherings. So we just did May 5th was the original 1984. May 5th was when the Portsmouth Comic Convention happened, that we premiered the first book. So we did an event yesterday with Ralph DiBernardo, who was the original host of that show. He now owns a store in Rochester, New Hampshire. We had a friend of ours come on, an actor named Nyambi. He's on The Good Fight right now, but he's a huge comic fan, huge comic geek. And he came down to an event at San Diego, then invited us to meet Chuck Lorre. We'll get to talk about Chuck Lorre right in the first theme song. And then May 15th, we're going to do watch TMNT with me, which would be The Secret of the Ooze.
That's great, man. That's fun, man.
Yeah, but if you go to Meta Studios for details, Kevin Eastman Studios for details, you can find anything we're doing, anything that's coming up, any specialties.
I got the wrong banner going. Here you go. This one, Kevin Eastman Studios. I put the banner up. I'm learning how to do this every day, because I'm not really the best broadcaster in the world, but we're getting there.
Well, I put it up on my MySpace page, but I don't get that much traffic anymore.
Yeah, MySpace kind of went the way. So the last thing that we'll do, because we have a lot to talk about. We did this last week, and I did hear from a few people that they love doing this. So we'll try not to mess it up. So last week we played a crazy game. We got 5 minutes left. We're gonna play this crazy game again. So this week, we get to play the game. Can you recognize what's in the background underneath the green screen? And the way that this works is, I show you something hidden right here, and this week the theme is comic book characters, and you guys have to see if you can tell me who's the comic book character. Now, you should be able to recognize most of them, but because I don't know anything about comics, I'm telling you right now, there are 10 of them I went like, I don't even know who that is. So apologies if you don't know who it is. Here comes Kevin, and you got to guess, and you guys can all guess in the stream Which comic book character is this? Who could this be?
Wonder Woman.
Come on, mate.
Bane, the Darkness. Incredible Hulk. Batman. No. Black Panther.
The Black.
Oh, God. I think I'm gonna be as bad as I had a really fun time with doing the toy one you did last week, last time. But
Yeah,
I love this is a great thing.
this is a great thing. It's just really funny. It cracks me up because we have to try to work out if we know who the hell they are. And I'll be honest with you, man, I don't know who the hell they are. So well done to you for being game and playing along. All right, here's the next one. We got a few of these. Here we go. Who is this? I got to be honest, I wouldn't recognize this person, but maybe you do. All right, who's this? Who could it be? Look, you can see a little bit of that.
It's like Cable.
It's Cable. Well done.
Cable? Oh, what? No way. That's awesome.
Yeah, it was Cable. Well done. You got that one right. Okay. I know so little about comics sometimes. I have to look at the screen up here because I made a list of them so I wouldn't forget who the hell they actually were. It's so bad. I've done comics for 25 years as a writer and I still don't know any of these characters. Here we go. Who would this be? Actually, this might give you a clue right here. Does that give you a clue?
Wait a sec. Oh, Deadpool. No, Gambit.
Gambit it is. Well done.
Oh, sweet. No, that's funny. No, when I said Deadpool, it reminded me, it's like, I've been in the business for 36 years, and I finally drew my first Marvel cover last year.
Oh, really? Well, you and I once were maybe going to try and do it, but we just couldn't get it together. But we were going to try and do Daredevil once. Okay, here we go. Hang on. Who could this be? You probably got some clues right here, I would think, because of that stuff.
I want to say Magneto or.
Oh, you're too good at this game, man.
What? No, see, now I'm getting some street cred right now because I am a big.
You are getting some street cred. I'm going to come from the top on this one. Yeah, go on. Hang on. Up here. Look, see?
I want to say it's not Black Widow. It's not. Oh, man. Who is that? Is it one of the X-Men?
Yeah, apparently it's. Hang on. I'm looking. It's Mystique.
Mystique.
It's probably just not a very good, or at least a different version of Mystique, I think. I don't know.
Well, that's because I have when I was doing I did a cover for House of X. You have to do a Wolverine, but I did a cover for X-Men #1, and I put Rachel Summers and Jean Grey on the cover. But they've reinvented, and there's so many different universes of them. So even when I was trying to do some research to find out which version it was like.
Yeah, I think that's the problem, is that there are different versions of these. So I'm always sort of like, who is this? I don't know, right? Right? It looks a bit different sometimes. So let me bring up the next one. Hang on. Having computer problem. Okay, who is now? I'll be honest with you. I don't think I know who this is anyway. But go on. Who's this? Do you have any idea? Oh God.
That's it. What happened?
Let's try this again. Okay. Do you have any idea who this might be? There's the uniform. Any idea?
What the hell?
Do you know who that is?
No.
So apparently this is someone called Omega Red. I didn't know.
Omega Red?
Yeah.
I knew that was in the morning. It's like a fish oil thing.
Yeah, I don't know what that was, but apparently that's Omega Red. So you lose a point right there, but you're really on top of this game. By the way, for getting points, you get nothing. Right, who is this? Who could this be? Oh, it was very much a boob shot, this one, by the way. Look.
No, it's he's definitely one of the X-Men. It's not.
You are right. It's one of the X-Men.
What's her name? Elektra. I'm getting blind. It's not Elektra. It's
It is Psylocke.
Psylocke, yes. Olivia Munn played her in the last movie.
Okay, Psylocke, right. This one here, you kind of either know this one or you don't, because the next one I know you're going to know. Okay, you kind of either know this one or you don't. Who is this? Can we get any clues? Who could this be?
Geez.
No, you ran out.
No,
that one is Pyro.
Oh, Pyro.
Yeah, Pyro.
Yeah. I thought it was the
Pyro. That's crazy. All right. I think you're not even going to have any problem with this one. This one's going to be easy. Ready? Here we go. We'll come from oh, wait a minute. That's the wrong one. I got to change it. Hang on. Here we go. Who could? I already did it.
Scarlet Witch.
Scarlet Witch. Yeah, that was too easy. This one, I do hope you get. I hope you get this one. Who could this be?
Oh, the Sentry.
Yay! Hey, Kevin, who created the Sentry?
That was Marv Wolfman.
That's right. No. All right, we've only got, mercifully, we only have a couple more of these to go. This one is so easy. Now I'm going to give you like a different sort of view of this one. Here we go. Who could this be?
Silver Surfer.
The Silver Surfer, and I only showed the bottom of it just because it was so easy. We're going with boobs this time again. Whose boobs are these? Whose boobs are these?
Oh, the Valkyrie.
Valkyrie, yes, well done. Valkyrie's boobs. This one, you get literally, you have to get the answer of this in 2 seconds. You ready? Hang on, over here. Here we go. You got to get the answer of this in 2 seconds.
Wolverine.
We're almost done. You have to get the answer to this one in 3 seconds. Ready?
Hulk. No, Savage Dragon.
Savage Dragon, yeah. That's just properly. There's a Savage Dragon. Almost done. This one you have to get in 1 second. Literally, I'm going to hold it up for 1 second. You ready?
All right.
Who's that? Oh, no, wait a minute. Who's that?
Oh, it's Ben Grimm. No, it's Human Torch. No, it's Reed Richards.
Yeah, it's the Human Torch. And then last one, I think this is a very fitting way to end because of part of our conversation. Who do you think this could be? Hang on, let's bring it over. Who could
Swamp Thing?
That is Swamp Thing, and guess what? In Jesus pose as well.
Oh, love it. That's a great way to end. That's a perfect way to round it out.
All right, brother. Well, we had fun again, and we got some good guesses. Thank you so much for everybody for coming. Please tell your friends, try the veal. Kevin, we got a bunch of stuff coming up from you from Facebook and all kinds and go to Kevin Eastman Studios and buy comics, I guess, because you sell comics, right?
We sell everything. Furniture, anything you see in the background you like, if you want to find out, there's tons of free content. We've been putting up loads of digital copies of anything. Just find something fun to read, and you don't have to spend any money. Just come and hang out and say hi. And but if you want to know what we're doing, any events, and keep track of, because we're going to do a couple more of these at least. And but stay tuned in, and we're just having a blast. I really enjoy doing these, Paul.
Yeah, this is fun. And so next week we got a very special show, because I'm kid you not, we are going to do the crazy next week. We are going to tell you guys a bunch of crazy stories that you've never heard. And when you hear some of these stories, you're going to go like, oh my God, I can't believe it, right? So next week is crazy. Thank you all much. And brother, thank you always.
Thank you.
See you soon, all right?
Awesome, buddy.
Cheers.
Cheers.